It was the day after Christmas and Dr. Watson had made his way to 221B Baker Street, the residence of his dear friend and colleague, Sherlock Holmes. The cold winter air was biting, and Dr. Watson was eager to get inside and warm himself by the fire. He rapped on the door and was greeted by Mrs. Hudson, the landlady of the building. "Good morning, Dr. Watson," Mrs. Hudson said with a smile. "It's good to see you. Mr. Holmes is in the sitting room." Dr. Watson made his way up the stairs and entered the sitting room, where he found Sherlock Holmes by the window, surrounded by newspapers and a magnifying glass in his hand. "You're working on something, I presume?" Dr. Watson asked. "Yes, I am," Holmes replied, not taking his eyes off the newspapers. "But sit down, my friend, I have something of interest to show you." Dr. Watson took a seat and looked at where Holmes was pointing. On a chair near the detective was an old, tattered hat. "What of it?" Dr. Watson asked. "That, my dear Watson, is what I would like you to take a closer look at," Holmes replied with a hint of excitement in his voice. Dr. Watson picked up the hat and examined it closely. It was a simple, worn-out hat that showed signs of much use and wears. "Why are you interested in this hat, Holmes?" Dr. Watson asked. "Ah, that is the mystery," Holmes replied with a smile. "It was left outside the door this morning and I find myself intrigued by it." "Intrigued?" Dr. Watson repeated. "How so?" "Well, take a look at the hatband," Holmes instructed. Dr. Watson did as he was told, and upon closer inspection, he noticed something written on the inside of the hatband. "It says James Robinson, tailor, 39 High Street, Paddington," Dr. Watson read aloud. "Precisely," Holmes said, nodding. "Now, I have taken the liberty of sending a message to the tailor and I expect a reply any moment now, but I would like you to accompany me when we go and meet him." "Of course," Dr. Watson said, putting down the hat. "I'll accompany you wherever you go." Just then, there was a knock on the door and Mrs. Hudson entered the room with a letter in her hand. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson said, handing him the letter. Holmes took the letter and tore it open eagerly. He read it silently and then looked up at Dr. Watson with a smile. "The reply has arrived," Holmes said. "We are to meet Mr. Robinson at his shop at 3 o'clock this afternoon." "Well, then," Dr. Watson said, standing up, "we had better not waste any time." The two friends made their way to Paddington, where they found the shop of James Robinson, tailor. They entered the shop and were greeted by a friendly man with a tape measure around his neck. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Mr. Robinson said. "How may I be of assistance?" "We're here in regards to the hat," Holmes said, holding up the old hat. "We found it outside our door this morning and it has your name and address written on the inside of the hatband." "Ah, yes," Mr. Robinson said, taking the hat from Holmes and examining it closely. "This is one of my creations, no doubt about it, but I don't recall ever selling this particular hat. Can you tell us anything about the person who might have bought it?" Dr. Watson asked. "Well, let me think," Mr. Robinson said, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "It's been a few years since I made this hat, but I do have records of all my sales. If you gentlemen would wait just a moment, I'll be right back." Mr. Robinson disappeared into the back room, leaving Dr. Watson and Holmes to look around the shop. The shop was filled with bolts of cloth, buttons, and all manner of tailoring supplies. After a few moments, Mr. Robinson returned with a ledger in his hand. "Here we are," Mr. Robinson said, opening the ledger and running his finger down the page. "Ah, here it is. This hat was sold to a Mr. John Smith, who lived on Baker Street." Baker Street, Dr. Watson repeated in surprise. Indeed, Holmes said, his eyes lighting up. Thank you for your time, Mr. Robinson. You have been most helpful. The two friends left the shop and made their way back to 221B Baker Street, their minds filled with the mystery of the old hat and the mysterious Mr. John Smith. What do you make of it, Holmes? Dr. Watson asked as they made their way up the stairs to their sitting room. I think we have the start of a very interesting case, Holmes replied with a smile, and I have a feeling that this old hat is just the beginning. Once back in their sitting room, Holmes immediately set to work examining the old hat. He scrutinized every stitch, every inch of the brim, and even sniffed the fabric to see if there was any scent to it. Dr. Watson watched him in fascination, knowing that there was no detail too small for his friend to overlook. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Holmes sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Well, it's not much to go on, but I think I've learned a few things about this hat. What have you discovered? Dr. Watson asked, eager to hear what his friend had found. First of all, this hat is not quite as old as it appears, Holmes said, holding it up for Dr. Watson to see. The fabric is well worn, but the stitching and construction are quite recent, and the scent of the fabric leads me to believe that it was made by the same tailor who made the coat that Mr. Robinson showed us. So it's not an antique, then, Dr. Watson said, disappointed. No, it's not, Holmes said, but it is still quite puzzling. There is something about this hat that troubles me. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Watson rose to answer it, finding a man on the doorstep who appeared to be in a state of great distress. Mr. Holmes, Mr. Watson, the man cried. Thank goodness you're here. I need your help. What is it, man? Dr. Watson asked, concerned. It's my wife, the man exclaimed. She's gone missing, and I fear for her safety. Come in, Dr. Watson said, leading the man into the sitting room. Mr. Holmes, this is Mr. Edward Parker. He says his wife has gone missing. Yes, that's right, Mr. Parker said, wringing his hands. She went out for a walk yesterday morning and never came back. I've searched everywhere, but I can't find her. Tell us what happened, Mr. Parker, Holmes said, his eyes sharp and focused. Well, she went out for a walk as she often does, Mr. Parker said, but this time, she didn't come back. I've searched everywhere, but I can't find her. And there's something else, something strange. I found this hat near where she was last seen. Mr. Parker produced a hat from his pocket and handed it to Holmes. The detective took the hat and examined it closely. Ah, this is very interesting, he said. What is it? Dr. Watson asked, looking from one man to the other. This is the same hat we saw at Mr. Robinson's shop, Holmes said, the one that was sold to a Mr. John Smith on Baker Street. That's right, Mr. Parker said, his eyes wide. Do you think it's connected to my wife's disappearance? It's too soon to say, Holmes said, but I think it's worth investigating. Come, Watson, we have work to do. The two friends set off with Mr. Parker, determined to find the missing Mrs. Parker and uncover the mystery of the old hat. They had no idea of the danger that lay ahead, but they were determined to solve the case and bring the truth to light. The three men quickly made their way to the area where Mrs. Parker was last seen. Holmes immediately set to work examining the area, his eyes keen and sharp as he took in every detail. What do you see, Holmes? Dr. Watson asked, as he watched his friend work. I see several things that are quite interesting, Holmes said. First of all, there are no signs of a struggle. The ground is not disturbed and there are no broken branches or footprints. It's almost as if she simply vanished into thin air. But what could have happened to her, Mr. Parker asked, fear in his voice. It's too early to say, Holmes said, but I'm hoping that these footprints will give us some clues. Holmes pointed to a set of footprints that led off into the distance. These footprints are quite small, indicating that the person who made them was likely female, and they are fresh, indicating that they were made recently. The three men set off, following the footprints as they led deeper into the woods. As they walked, Holmes continued to examine the area, taking note of any signs of disturbance or anything that looked out of place. Finally, after several hours of searching, they came upon a small clearing, and there, lying on the ground, was Mrs. Parker. Is she alive? Mr. Parker asked, rushing to his wife's side. Yes, she is, Holmes said, examining the woman, but she's unconscious. Let's get her back to town and to a doctor. The three men quickly made their way back to town, carrying Mrs. Parker between them. As they walked, Holmes continued to think about the case, trying to piece together what had happened. Finally, after several hours of walking, they arrived back in town. Mrs. Parker was taken to a doctor, and the two friends set to work trying to find out what had happened to her. They started by interviewing the people in the area, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It seemed that Mrs. Parker's disappearance was a complete mystery. But Holmes was not one to give up easily. He knew that there had to be some clue, some piece of evidence that would lead him to the truth, and he was determined to find it, no matter how long it took. After several days of searching for clues and interviewing the people in the area, Holmes and Dr. Watson still had no leads in the case of Mrs. Parker's disappearance. However, Holmes was not one to give up easily. He knew that somewhere, there was a piece of evidence that would help him solve the mystery. One day, as they were sitting in the local inn, they overheard a man talking about a strange man who had been seen lurking around the woods near where Mrs. Parker had disappeared. Holmes immediately jumped at the opportunity to investigate this new lead. Watson, come on, he said, grabbing his friend by the arm. We have a new clue to follow. The two men quickly made their way back to the woods and began searching for any sign of the strange man who had been seen lurking around. They searched for hours, but found nothing. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. But Holmes was not deterred. He knew that the man was the key to solving this case, and he was determined to find him. So, he and Dr. Watson continued to search, day after day, until finally, they came upon a small cabin in the woods. The cabin was old and dilapidated, and as they approached, they could see a man sitting inside. Holmes and Dr. Watson cautiously approached the cabin, their senses on high alert. As they entered the cabin, the man looked up, his eyes wild and frightened. "What do you want?" he shouted, fear in his voice. "We're here to ask you some questions," Holmes said calmly. "We heard that you were seen lurking around the woods near where Mrs. Parker disappeared." The man hesitated for a moment, and then began to speak. "Yes, I was there," he said, "but I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I was just trying to find some food." Holmes listened intently, his mind working quickly as he tried to determine if the man was telling the truth. And then, suddenly, he noticed something strange. "What's that on your arm?" he asked, pointing to a small mark on the man's arm. The man quickly tried to cover the mark, but it was too late. Holmes had already seen it. "It's a mark from a poison dart," he said, his eyes blazing. "You're the one who took Mrs. Parker." The man looked down, defeated. "Yes," He said, "I took her, but I didn't mean to. I was just trying to find food, and she was the only one around. I had no choice." Holmes quickly sprang into action, grabbing the man and bringing him to the local authorities. And with that, the mystery of Mrs. Parker's disappearance was finally solved. As they made their way back to the inn, Holmes and Dr. Watson talked about the case, trying to make sense of what had happened. "It's strange how things can turn out," Dr. Watson said. "The man who took Mrs. Parker was just trying to find food, and yet he ended up causing so much trouble." "Yes, that is the strange thing about life," Holmes said. "One small decision can change everything." And with that, the two friends settled in for the night, their minds still racing with the events of the day. They knew that there would always be more mysteries to solve, but for now, they were content to have solved this one. It had only been a few days since the resolution of the case involving Mrs. Parker's disappearance, but Holmes and Dr. Watson were already faced with another mystery. This time, it was a case of a missing jewel. The owner of the jewel, Lady Elizabeth, had come to Baker Street seeking the help of the great detective. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot believe this has happened," Lady Elizabeth exclaimed as she entered the sitting room. "The jewel has been in my family for generations, and now it is gone." Holmes listened intently as Lady Elizabeth told the story of how she had woken up one morning to find that the diamond had disappeared from her bedroom. The room had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. "I cannot imagine who would have taken it," she said, her voice shaking, "but I need your help to find it. I cannot bear the thought of it being lost forever." Holmes took on the case, and he and Dr. Watson began their investigation. They visited the estate where Lady Elizabeth lived and talked to all of the servants. They even went so far as to search the estate, but still, they found no sign of the missing diamond. Days passed, and the two detectives were no closer to finding the missing jewel. But then, one day, as they were sitting in the local inn, they overheard a conversation between two men. One of the men was talking about a man who had recently come into a large sum of money. Holmes and Dr. Watson immediately jumped at the opportunity to investigate this new lead. They followed the man to his home, where they confronted him. "We have reason to believe that you have the missing diamond," Holmes said, his eyes narrowed. The man looked at them, a mix of fear and defiance in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But Holmes was not to be deterred. He continued to question the man. And finally, the man broke down and confessed. He had taken the diamond, but he had not meant to. He had been in desperate need of money, and the diamond had been too tempting to resist. With the man in custody, Holmes and Dr. Watson quickly returned the diamond to Lady Elizabeth. She was overjoyed at its return, and she thanked the two detectives for their help. "You truly are the greatest detectives in all of England," she said. And with that, the mystery of the missing jewel was solved. But Holmes and Dr. Watson knew that there would always be more mysteries to solve, and they were ready for whatever came their way. It was a beautiful summer day when Holmes and Dr. Watson were called to the scene of a mysterious death. The victim was a wealthy businessman, Mr. Jameson, and the circumstances surrounding his death were peculiar. When they arrived at the scene, they were greeted by the local inspector who filled them in on the details. Mr. Jameson had been found dead in his office, with no signs of forced entry and no apparent motive for his murder. Holmes and Dr. Watson immediately began their investigation. They spoke to Mr. Jameson's business partners, his family, and his employees, but no one seemed to have a motive for his murder. As they continued to search for answers, they stumbled upon a strange piece of evidence. It was a letter that had been found in Mr. Jameson's office, addressed to him but never sent. The letter was filled with cryptic messages, and Holmes and Dr. Watson couldn't help but think that it was connected to Mr. Jameson's death. As they delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a web of lies and deceit. It turned out that Mr. Jameson had been involved in illegal business dealings, and he had made many enemies in the process. One of those enemies had finally caught up to him, leading to his untimely death. With the murderer in custody, the mystery was finally solved, but as always, Holmes and Dr. Watson were already looking ahead to the next case that would come their way. It was a quiet afternoon when a wealthy collector, Mr. Phillips, came to Baker Street in a panic. His collection of rare paintings had been stolen, and he was desperate for help. Holmes and Dr. Watson immediately took on the case, determined to find the stolen paintings and bring the thief to justice. They began by investigating the scene of the crime, and they quickly discovered that the thief had been in and out of the house within minutes. As they continued their investigation, they discovered that the thief was a skilled professional, with a knowledge of the art world and a love for rare paintings. They also discovered that the thief had left behind a clue, a calling card of sorts, that indicated that the thief was taunting them. With this information in hand, Holmes and Dr. Watson set out to find the thief. They talked to art dealers, visited museums, and followed leads. Finally, they were able to track down the thief, who had been hiding out in a small village in France. With the thief in custody, the stolen paintings were returned to Mr. Phillips. He was overjoyed at their return and thanked the two detectives for their help. The case of the missing heir was a particularly perplexing one for Holmes and Dr. Watson. The heir, a young woman named Miss Elizabeth, had disappeared without a trace, and her family was desperate for answers. Holmes and Dr. Watson immediately took on the case, determined to find Miss Elizabeth and bring her back to her family. They searched high and low, talking to anyone who might have seen or heard anything about her. As they continued their investigation, they discovered that Miss Elizabeth had been involved in a secret love affair, and she had run away with her lover, but the lover had betrayed her, leaving her alone and afraid in a foreign country. With this information in hand, Holmes and Dr. Watson set out to find Miss Elizabeth. They traveled to a foreign country, where they finally found her. She was in a dire state, both physically and emotionally, but with the help of the two detectives, she was able to return to her family and receive the medical care she needed. But the case didn't end there. It turned out that the lover had stolen a large sum of money from Miss Elizabeth's family, and he was on the run. With the help of the local authorities, Holmes and Dr. Watson were able to track down the lover and bring him to justice. In a dire state, both physically and emotionally, but with the help of the two detectives, she was able to return to her family and receive the medical care she needed. But the case didn't end there. It turned out that the lover had stolen a large sum of money from Miss Elizabeth's family, and he was on the run. With the help of the local authorities, Holmes and Dr. Watson were able to track down the lover and bring him to justice. The case of the cursed diamond was one of the most intriguing cases that Holmes and Dr. Watson had ever taken on. The diamond, a rare and valuable gem, was said to bring misfortune and death to anyone who possessed it. Holmes and Dr. Watson were skeptical of the curse, but they couldn't deny the strange events that had been happening since the diamond had been discovered. People who had come into contact with the diamond had suffered terrible accidents, and some had even died. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Holmes and Dr. Watson set out to investigate. They spoke to the people who had come into contact with the diamond, and they soon discovered that there was more to the curse than just superstition. The diamond had been stolen from its rightful owner, a powerful and wealthy family. and the thieves were using the curse as a cover-up for their own criminal activities. With the help of the family, Holmes and Dr. Watson were able to track down the thieves and bring them to justice. The final case that Holmes and Dr. Watson took on was one of the most challenging cases of their careers. A wealthy businessman, Mr. Smith, had been receiving threatening letters, and he was afraid for his life. Holmes and Dr. Watson immediately took on the case, determined to protect Mr. Smith and bring the person behind the threats to justice. They began by investigating the letters, and they soon discovered that the threats were linked to a dark secret from Mr. Smith's past. As they continued their investigation, they uncovered a plot to blackmail Mr. Smith and ruin his reputation. With the help of the local authorities, Holmes and Dr. Watson were able to track down the blackmailer and bring them to justice. With the case finally solved, Holmes and Dr. Watson retired to their respective homes, reflecting on the many cases they had solved and the lives they had impacted. They would always be remembered as two of the greatest detectives of their time. In conclusion, we hope this story has provided you with an entertaining and educational experience as you improve your English through a story. We believe that stories are a powerful tool for language learning, and we hope you will continue to join us on this journey. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel for more stories and educational content. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more exciting stories in the future. So, until next time, happy learning!